and that we then hear from the rapporteur as soon as the rapporteur is with us.
President, maybe the plenary is so efficient today that people have not have time to go down the stairs. But honourable members, those of you who are here, I would like to talk about Australia and New Zealand tonight. As you know, they are friends, allies and partners of the European Union. We share a lot with them, our norms, our values, different approaches, and strengthening that relationship is a priority. The EU signed political framework agreements with both countries to further strengthen the partnership of the basis of these values: respect for democratic principles, human rights, fundamental freedoms, the rule of law, promotion together of international peace, of security, and also our joint work to strengthen the multilateral system and global rule-based trade. The EU has a healthy and mature trade and investment relationship with both these countries. We are one of the biggest partners of Australia and New Zealand in trades of goods, services and foreign direct investment. Australia and New Zealand have concluded foreign trade agreements with China, with ASEAN, with Japan, with Korea, and they are part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership with 11 countries, and they are moving ahead. These developments have made European exporters of goods, services and investors in a comparatively less favourable situation compared to the competitors in other countries. The Commission has carried out an impact assessment clearly showing the benefits of for European producers and consumers of these agreements. An already considerable EU export to both countries, on par with our export to Canada, could increase by 1/3 in the long term. The submission to the public consultation and the Commission's impact assessment paid particular attention to some significant sensitive sectors in European agriculture in the context of these free trade agreements and also what we do on a broad agenda: dairy, beef, sheep meat and sugar. The Commission made it absolutely clear to our partners in Australia and New Zealand that agricultural sensitivities must be taken into account in these negotiations. No full liberalisation can be imagined. The Commission therefore has proposed that the negotiating directives specifically include this aspect to ensure that the future agreement will not cause any disruption in the EU, including in our outermost regions. The 13th of September, as you recall, the Commission adopted recommendations for negotiating authorisation and directive for free trade agreements with Australia and New Zealand. An important difference with our recent practice is that these recommendations do not cover investment protection. But that does not mean that we will not negotiate investment protection agreements with Australia and New Zealand. But it doesn't have to be right now. We are followed the opinion of the Court of Justice on the Singapore Free Trade Agreement and engaged in a discussion with Member States about the future architecture of EU trade and investment agreement. And we have also taken into account what some Member States said, that if investment protection is proposed additionally, then the European Parliament, of course, should be consulted on that aspect as well. I just want to end with a few words on transparency. This is something that you, this Chamber, often and very rightly so, demand by the European Commission. And as I support transparency a lot as well, we have made public these recommendations to the world. We invited Member States to engage early with their national parliaments so that there can be an early discussion on these two negotiations, and of course also to facilitate your work on this and giving the general public an idea what trade negotiations are about and what is in these agreements. This is to strengthen, not to undermine, the important work that you do in this regard. These proposed directives are now under discussion in the Council. I hope that they will soon give us the authorisation to launch these negotiations without delay. And in this context, we welcome very much from the Commission your contribution, the debate tonight and the votes you will have tomorrow on this which contributes to give us a clear steer of the priorities of the European Parliament in the upcoming negotiations. We will, of course, as always, keep you closely informed about developments as we take these initiatives forward. The free trade agreements will help EU companies to have better access to the markets in Australia and New Zealand. These trade agreements can create jobs, bring about benefits to consumers, and also supporting workers' rights, environmental and climate change objectives. This initiative is framed by our strategy to promote openness based on values and standards with like-minded partners committed to progressive rules for global trade. This is another part of our work to build bridges, not walls, with a circle of friends who share our values. And this is also very much a political message, as well as an economic and trade policy question. So I'm looking very much forward to the debate tonight. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Muchas gracias, señora Malmström.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Malmström. We have the rapporteur among us, so Mrs. Quisthout now has the floor.
Sehr geehrte Frau Kommissarin.
Madam Commissioner, colleagues, I do apologize for rushing in at the last minute like this. In my political group, we've just been discussing this very subject. And I see that there's someone from the Agriculture Committee going to be speaking after me. And this is to do with trade and agriculture. I seek the support of Mr. Kaspari as regards the trade negotiations with Australia and New Zealand. The EPP has long sought free trade negotiations with those two countries. The United States have withdrawn from the TPP, completely redrawing the geopolitical map, and the time is therefore ripe for the EU to nail its colours to the free trade mast. And here I turn to the colleagues from the Agriculture Committee. Free trade in the interest of our farming. There are a number of Asia-Pacific countries with whom we've begun negotiations or indeed concluded agreements, and it is logical, therefore, that we now turn our attention to Australia and New Zealand. I'd like to mention a number of points. On the 13th of September, the Commission put forward mandates which are confined to trade and investment liberalisation agreements. The mandates are therefore confined to matters which fall within the remit of the European Union. My political group supports that approach, as does this House. This is good for Europe's trade policy. The political groups have agreed not to include investment protection in the reports. Should Council add investment protection, or should the Commission propose a second agreement including investment protection? The European Parliament will, without a doubt, take a stand on the issue, and will have to do so. Farming is a sensitive part of trade discussions with Australia and New Zealand. The political groups have rallied round a compromise which takes properly into account this sensitive subject. Next point, the sustainability chapter. The two big groups have different views on this, as do the smaller groups. The S&D want a penalty-based mechanism. The EPP frowns on such an approach. The compromise we've agreed on between the two political groups is based on past motions for resolution, such as the one on negotiations with Chile. I hope the other political groups will see fit to follow us. On behalf of the rapporteur, I turn to colleagues from the Agriculture Committee. I say to all colleagues who are worried about the consequences of free trade, I'd like to dispel your fears, because on the International Trade Committee we'll make sure that our standards, our social, environmental and consumer policy standards will be fully respected. Thank you.
Nekov.
Thank you, Mr. Nekov.
Dear colleagues, Madam Commissioner, New Zealand and Australia are our traditional partners, and we do have a potential to find common ground and secure growth. Still, full liberalization and implemented too fast would be counterproductive, especially for the agriculture in Europe. I support the report on New Zealand. Indeed, the sheep meat, the dairy products, and I would add honey, should be viewed as sensitive products, and they need to be subject to a special approach. For example, through quotas. The high European standards for animal welfare and European geographic indications should be among the priorities during the talks. I would like to speak also on behalf of the European producers. They are worried about Brexit and its consequences. It is necessary to review the existing quotas on the basis of the traditional presence on the market. For example, the sheep meat quotas should be reduced by 40%, because otherwise there will be a very serious pressure on European producers. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Señor Nicholson.
Thank you very much. Mr. Nicholson has the floor.
Please, micro. No?
Okay, now I'm ready to go. It has been clear for some time that Europe has been keen to open trade talks with Australia and New Zealand. I am firmly of the belief that an ambitious, balanced, comprehensive free trade arrangement with Australia and New Zealand can be of mutual benefit to both sides. However, any deal must respect the sensitivities of European agriculture, and I welcome the fact that Agri has the opportunity to come forward with this opinion. Producers across Europe are not anti-free trade. All they ask is a level playing field. Treating as sensitive products would be exposed the EU producers to excessive, unsustainable pressure. For instance, by introducing transitional periods, appropriate quotas and factoring in respect of seasonal cycles, especially and particularly for the lamb sector. Can I also say that agriculture cannot be also made the bargaining chip of these negotiations? The Commission needs to keep the European agri-food sector and MEPs informed of all aspects of negotiations, and I thank my shadow rapporteurs and for Australia and New Zealand and Mr Andreu for putting forward these opinions. And can I say to Mrs Christophe Roll, who I have known for a long time in this chamber, she entered the same time as I did, that although she's not listening at the moment, that she doesn't have to fear agriculture as much as she thinks.
Yeah. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Mr. Fjellner has the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Det borde vara en självklarhet för EU att teckna frihandelsavtal med två likasinnade länder som Australien och Nya Zeeland.
Thank you very much indeed. Australia and New Zealand are two out of very few countries which come up against a customs wall in their dealings with EU. I don't think Australia and New Zealand should be in this position. However, there is this very sensitive sector. The farming sector. I think we need to be bolder. We are the world's biggest exporter of farm products, and we've benefited from our farm product exports in the past and will continue to do so in future. I think we should see our relationship with Australia and New Zealand as positive and not a source of worry.
Gracias, señora Gras.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Graswander has the floor.
Sehr geehrter Präsident,
President, Commissioner, colleagues, Australia, New Zealand, these are highly developed countries with shared characteristics, and this is why we need to have an agreement that includes high standards, and the negotiations need to be conducted in a transparent way, because all the national parliaments and the general public all have a right to information. I am an optimist, and as the Commissioner said earlier, that this was the first time the negotiating mandate was made public, and so I have every confidence that any future mandates will also be made public, and this is where the European Parliament also needs to have a stronger role to play and greater involvement, all the way from the agreeing on the mandate right through to the end of the negotiations. One of the pillars of trade policy is that you need to have a strong sustainability chapter that will protect workers, consumers and the environment. Violations of agreements need at the end of the day lead to sanctions. Labour and environmental standards need to be implementable. Let's take this opportunity of a potential agreement with Australia and New Zealand. It could be an opportunity, and it could be a good blueprint for future examples if these negotiations are not conducted behind closed doors, and if we can therefore improve the standards. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Mr. Campbell has the floor.
It seems odd that only the ECR group seems to recognise that Australia and New Zealand are different countries with separate trade deals and not one nation, as this debate suggests. I would not advise calling an Australian a New Zealander, nor a New Zealander an Australian, especially not if they play rugby for the All Blacks. But I do welcome doing free trade agreements with both these great independent democratic trading nations. It is well overdue. Now, existing bilateral arrangements and regulatory cooperation make the case for a deeper agreement to be negotiated relatively easy. I note that the New Zealand deal may be based on around 80% of the recent Canada or CETA trade deal, which is considered to be a gold standard. My group does take issue with two key points in the report, though. Firstly, the inclusion of a sanctions-based mechanism on the Trade and Sustainable Development, or TSD, chapter. This is an ineffective approach which discourages goodwill and damages engagement in negotiations. And second, the exclusion of the so-called sensitive agricultural sectors from the report. Australia and New Zealand have the right to promote their agricultural exports, and it is a sorry state of affairs when the EU embraces protectionism. Our partners have made clear they would enter negotiations with an open mind, and it is a shame the European Commission is not doing the same. Thank you.
Gracias, señor.
Thank you, Mr. Takkula.
Kiitoksia, arvoisa.
Thank you, Mr. President. Commissioner, colleagues, Australia and New Zealand. Yes, Mr. Campbell-Bannerman, we know they're two different countries, two different agreements, but they both share the EU's values. We and they have the same values, and it makes sense to enhance our trade cooperation. We have a court judgment which defines our room for maneuver in trade agreements. So I hope that we can move swiftly. I am essentially happy with this report. I'd like to raise, though, two issues where I think we can fine-tune the text and make it more balanced. Removing the sensitive farm sector from the mandate, that is one point I'd like to remove. The Commission will, of course, act as it sees fit. Leaving this outside the mandate isn't a pragmatic approach, and that's why I'd like to exclude that form of words. As regards the possible penalties in the sustainability chapter, there, I think a pragmatic approach would be more appropriate. We should establish what is technically possible and only then decide on the practice. I do hope, therefore, that we will have a good and balanced agreement. I rely on the Commissioner. I trust the Commissioner and the Commissioner's team to be able to negotiate a trade agreement which serves both sides. And it is vital not to lose sight of the fact that any agreement is based on values. We share values with Australia and New Zealand, so we have every chance of success. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, señor.
Thank you, Mr. Yarik. Thank you, President. Madam Commissioner, the negotiations with Australia and New Zealand do not constitute a partnership, as you say. It is moving forward the free trade agenda where the multinationals are ruling with little regard for small-scale producers. Now, when it comes to the allocation of quotas that may be changed following Brexit, we will be dealing with some of the most competitive agriculture producers in the world. So, bearing in mind that the meat and dairy sectors are in a deep crisis, pursuing these negotiations further after CETA and Mercosur would be signing the death sentence of a sustainable sector which creates dignified jobs. Now, we defend free trade with these two countries, but we don't want to support this rampant free trade agenda.
Vielen Dank, Herr Präsident.
Thank you very much, President, and welcome, Commissioner and colleagues.
Azul. Pardon?
Was there a blue card?
Una tarjeta azul del señor Filner dirigida.
There's a blue card request from Mr. Yarik. Would you accept this blue card?
No. Espera.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd just like to pose one question to the last speaker. I wonder if he's aware of the fact that France, which he represents, is a net exporter of agricultural products, and you seem to want to roll back agricultural trade in general, as you think it doesn't benefit the farmers. But don't you think the French farmers happen to be one of the biggest winners due to the fact that you're one of the biggest exporters? Who do you really represent when coming with such claims?
Dans mon pays,
in my country, more than 1/3 of farmers earn less than €350 per month, and one farmer commits suicide every 2 days. So we can come back to this issue another time. With regard to New Zealand and Australia, looking at the sheep meat sector, that is really not under control. And when you put all the agreements together, Canada, Mercosur, and put all them together, the combined effect will kill the sector in Europe. And the French farmers, especially the small-scale producers, are really dying out. And I don't want to see this continue. Thank you very much. Now, Mrs. Buchner has the floor.
President, Madam Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen, this apple, is it going to be imported from New Zealand? If it does, then it's going to have done as many air miles as many ministers have. Australia and New Zealand, a new free trade agreement. Tomorrow we're going to be debating this, or rather voting on this, here in plenary. And the question arises, do we really need these agreements? Our industry, of course, wants to export machinery and cars and all the rest of it. And Australia wants to export coal, uranium, New Zealand meat, dairy, and so on and so forth. Is it really sensible for milk or agricultural products to be transported halfway around the globe at a time when we have got enough and more sufficient and too much already ourselves? Do we really need to import more? Of course, those countries can produce cheaper than us because they have not got the high animal protection standards which we have. And that means that we're going to be losing out in terms of jobs. And it's not true that across the board we're going to be creating new jobs. Look at NAFTA and what happened there. In other words, the agreement between the US, Canada and Mexico. There 800,000 jobs were lost, particularly in agriculture. And so quite apart from that, with these agreements, it's not purely a trade affair. That would be easier. It would be easier if we simply removed the tariffs and had the same standards. Then we wouldn't need the agreements. Modern free trade agreements are different altogether. And this really restricts, to an extent, circumscribes our legislation. And it's really interesting to look at the language used in the CETA agreement, because there it talks about unacceptable restrictions for trade needing to be removed, or rather no new ones are to be introduced. But of course we do not determine or dictate what that is. That's some industrial interests. In other words, this is a deep inroad into our freedom and our sovereignty. And you could put it a different way. You could say that with these free trade agreements, the neoliberal market is imported lock, stock and barrel. Thank you very much.
Señor Gill.
Thank you, Mr. Gill.
New Zealand will be a litmus test for the EU and the UK to see how each fares after the so-called divorce. It's no surprise that the EU has chosen these countries to kick off post-Brexit talks and wants to complete a trade deal as soon as possible. I suspect it may be a case of one-upmanship. As it is said, if you cannot do trade with New Zealand, you cannot do it with anyone, as New Zealand is one of the most liberal trading nations in the world. In fact, no other country has so many mutual regulatory agreements with the EU already in place than New Zealand, preparing the ground for a swift and a smooth FTA. No other country, that is, but the UK. Like our self-determining Commonwealth cousins, we are also champions of free trade. Yet the UK starts from a position of even greater commonality with the EU, following decades of harmonised legislation. So, do a good deal with New Zealand and Australia. Prove to the world that the EU is serious about free trade, but be warned, you must also do a good deal with Britain. The eyes of the world are watching, and if another nation sees petty, preferential or protectionist treatment to spite a Britain that simply wants to govern itself, as indeed they do in Wellington and Canberra, it will be Brussels that is judged, not Brexit.
Gracias. Señora Jamet.
Thank you. Mrs. Jamet has the floor.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, Madam Rapporteur, I think it's vital to say on the floor of the House that Australia is the world's third largest beef exporter and also a huge exporter of sugar, cereals and milk. New Zealand is one of the main exporters of lamb. Well, here we are, beef, lamb, milk, and the other sectors I mentioned. These are the sectors that are going to be affected in France and across Europe. And what about the carbon footprint? 15,000 kilometers, and yet we have fantastic meat here in the European Union. We're supposed to be environment friendly, and what worries me even more is the threat to human health, to consumer health. Those two countries allow practices in animal husbandry which we do not. I'm not happy with the level of secrecy, the fact that documents are not made available to members of this House while they are made available to multinationals who are allegedly involved in negotiating trade agreements. Please reassure me that the national parliaments will be consulted and tell me when. I understand that the text is not going to be set in stone. It's going to be governed by common law, and it will be possible for the text to be amended in the interest of the multinationals. That's clearly not something we want.
Gracias, presidente.
Thank you, President. I'd like to thank Mr. Kaspari for his work on this file, and I'd like to talk about Australia. It's a very important country in a region that is very dynamic. Australia has a very strong and open economy, and the EU is the second largest exporter to the country following China. So an agreement would improve trade relations with this country. And the European Union has signed recently a framework agreement with the country. And a future FTA would give us a very solid basis for very, very close ties with a country that is distant in geometry only, but not in terms of values and history. So let us strengthen this relation. The future of the EU 27 needs to be tied in with the future of Australia, and we need foreign markets. So, Commissioner, let me encourage you in your work and to pursue these trade agreements. Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you. Mrs. Mosca has the floor.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, President. Trade policy is not able to solve all our problems, but it's nonetheless a very potent instrument. If you remember what President Juncker was saying in the course of his State of the Union speech. And we have got a leading role worldwide to play in trade, and therefore we welcome the announcement of the start to negotiations with Australia and New Zealand, because this means we can have basically global ground rules, which I think will stand us in good stead. Just a few points. I would insist that when it comes to transparency, we need to see the same enthusiasm on the part of the Council. Secondly, impacts on our internal market. We must be able to intervene in the event of surges, particularly over the transitional period. Thirdly, sustainable development. This is must be an effective and binding intervention method. Fourthly, at every stage of the negotiations, this House wants to be part of the process, wants to be in the loop, and wants to be kept up to date and be an active participant, so that we can have more effective democratic scrutiny and full respect for our prerogatives. We need to give the necessary assurances to citizens and also point out that there are opportunities here as well. Fifthly, to get maximum reciprocity, not just in terms of market access, but also public procurement, quality and security, safety of products in the reserved sectors for national authorities. And finally, we welcome the fact that this can be an opportunity for dialogue which will improve potential on both sides, and remove distortion. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Zahadil has the floor.
Mr. President, Madam Commissioner, it's been a long time, but finally we've got there, and I have to say that I am very happy that we are to start negotiations about free trade agreement with Australia and New Zealand for at least 3 reasons. One is that what we have here are 2 like-minded partners, very stable countries, the fastest growing developed economies, and free trade agreements with them will definitely help to deliver jobs, growth and investment and benefit EU businesses and citizens alike. Secondly, I see a window of opportunity for the entire European Union to promote free trade worldwide after the United States became a bit more hesitant in that direction, and I think that we should use that. And thirdly, last but not least, as a rapporteur for a free trade agreement between the EU and Vietnam, I can only welcome that we are opening new opportunities in the Pacific regions, and I think that it's only good news that we will cooperate more with the most dynamic economic region in the world. Thank you very much.
Gracias, señora Vana.
Thank you, Mrs. Vanna.
Vielen Dank, Herr Präsident.
Thank you, President. It cannot be that the parliamentary scrutiny roles and the role of the national parliaments is being circumvented under the cover of a pretext that only EU competences are being covered by this agreement. Experience from CETA and other agreements has taught us that when it comes to FTAs, little notice taken of citizens' interests, and that in general parliaments are excluded from the negotiations. So we want to have some assurances that national parliaments will have a role to play and can play an active role in defending the rights and interests of citizens. National parliaments should be able to give an opinion before the Commission is given a formal mandate. We want fair rules for governing global trade that isn't dictated by a powerful few. We want to take services out of the mandate, and we want to protect environmental and labour standards. These are important rights for citizens in Europe.
Castaldo.
Thank you, Mr. Castaldo.
Thank you, President, Commissioner, colleagues. Australia and New Zealand are very far away, but they can also be major trade partners for the EU and for Italy. And sometimes there are real advantages. We export twice as much to New Zealand as we import, and 7 times more with Australia. And beyond a doubt, this is a stepping stone, as a kind of bridgehead between Europe and the Pacific region as well, the Pacific Rim and the Far East. We must protect animal production, cheese and agriculture in general. And these are big producers of meat and also of dairy products. And they have got a major export record as well. And we're not going to be able to have an agreement in these areas. Tomorrow we're only talking about effective negotiating mandates. And we have fought very hard to make sure that the final treaty does have geographical indications, safeguards, tariff quotas and special protective measures. which have been requested by the agricultural associations as well. In particular, we want equity, transparency and legal certainty in the best interests of citizens. And therefore, let me express a hope that Council will do the right thing, will listen to us, and that once the negotiating mandate comes up, it will be a joint agreement involving the EU and the Member States. And I think that consumers' rights and citizens' rights are not negotiable. Thank you very much.
Señor Obermayr.
Thank you. Mr. Obermayr has the floor. Thank you, President. Now, with the breaking off of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, there is now an opportunity with regard to trade policy, and I think it's right to use that opportunity. And the agreements with China, Japan, and others, I think, really also need to be exploited fully in terms of the potential that's there. But looking at some of the wording of the mandate, I think is rather vague and open to interpretation. For example, it talks about energy and national companies, and I think this leaves a lot of room for interpretation. And when you think about the potential flood of the huge amounts of agricultural products produced in New Zealand and Australia, and then finally also the dispute settlement mechanisms, which once again are in here. So there is hope now, a little bit of hope with greater transparency, but there's still some key points that really need to be looked at very carefully in the interests of our citizens. Thank you.
Gracias, señor Seinfeld.
Thank you, Mr. Seinfeld.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. President. Cooperation between the European Union on the one hand and New Zealand and Australia on the other works rather well. There is considerable trade, something like 58 billion euros worth. 8 billion is New Zealand and 45 with Australia. However, more is possible. In the limited time I have available, I don't want to dwell on economic matters. What I liked about what the Commissioner said is that she said, we want to build bridges, not walls. Hearing other members, I get the sense that there's a desire to build walls, whereas the European Union is quite clearly about building bridges in a world built on mutual understanding, mutual cooperation, and acting together in quest of peace and prosperity. Thank you.
Gracias, señor Martin.
Thank you, Mr. Martin.
President, this for me is a bittersweet moment. I've argued in this Parliament for over 20 years for free trade agreements with Australia and with New Zealand, and they've finally arrived. Negotiations are about to begin, and by the time these negotiations are complete, I'm afraid my country will no longer be part of the European Union and unable to take advantage of the free trade agreement. It's also a bittersweet moment, though, because the Trade Committee, of all committees, has, in my opinion, produced quite a protectionist resolution, and I hope we can amend some of that tomorrow. It's quite right, as colleagues have said, that we should want to protect or defend certain sensitive products, make sure we have quotas on certain products, make sure we negotiate safeguards for certain products, but to ask for a whole sector to be excluded from negotiations is a crazy way to begin negotiations, especially if that sector is the key sector for our negotiating partners. Why would the Australians or the New Zealanders make concessions to us on GIs, on non-agricultural market access, or on sustainable development, which is so important to my group, if we're not even prepared to start talking about agriculture? It's a cow cuckoo land position to have.
Gracias.
Thank you. Mr. Kuzmiuk.
Dziękuję bardzo.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. President, Commissioner. In this debate about the mandate for the Commission for trade negotiations with Australia and New Zealand, I'd like to emphasize that it is unacceptable to sacrifice EU farming on the altar of free trade. The EU 27 without the UK is a market of 440 million citizens. That's 20 times more than in Australia and New Zealand. Australia and New Zealand are massive producers of farm products. They have lower prices. 70% of what they produce they export. This is a threat to EU farming. In any trade agreement with those countries, in addition to the limitations already mentioned, there should be safeguard measures which will be automatically triggered if farm imports from Australia and New Zealand exceed certain limits which could upset the balance on the EU agricultural market. Thank you.
Gracias. Señor Kelly.
Thank you. Mr. Kelly has the floor.
Margaret coming from Ireland, which has very close links, both culturally and in other matters, with both Australia and New Zealand, I can see the logic of doing a trade agreement with them. Indeed, right now our President, Mr. Higgins, is in Australia, and he opened our first embassy in New Zealand today. And 1 in 6 New Zealanders claim Irish ancestry. So it's logical that we should, particularly at the time of Trump's actions in the United States, try and expand free trade with places that will be beneficial to us and to them. But unfortunately the timing here isn't the best. With Mercosur and Brexit, the agricultural community are very concerned, and their concerns must certainly be taken on board, and they must be brought on board if this agreement is to go ahead, because you cannot force something through if one sector doesn't see it doing them any advantage, or worse, doing them a disadvantage. So I would think that it's right we should negotiate, but we have to do so and ensure that we get a very balanced, acceptable deal at the end of the day with our good friends from the Southern Hemisphere. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Gracias, señor Moguer.
Thank you, Mr. Mariel.
Merci. Thank you very much, President. I do apologise to David Martin. I have got a real affection for him, but I disagree with what he's just said. We have a debate. We're having a debate on Australia and New Zealand, but the question is, this untrammelled activism on the part of the Commission negotiating free trade agreements hand over fist, like some kind of Pavlovian reflex. And the question is, why? And I don't think I'm the only person asking. There are millions of Europeans who are worried and do not understand the reason. And in this particular case, the argument is that these are historical allies. We've got to be open-minded. But that's a bit thick. There are real risks for dairy, for animal production, sugar. There are real dangers and risks, particularly for individual countries, Mr. Fjellner, because there are agricultural models which are under threat, in particular small holdings, small farmers. And when we talk about climate change, we are intensifying trade with countries which are 10,000 miles away, and I don't think that's very good for our carbon footprint. So let's have a pause rather than alarming people unnecessarily. Thank you.
Honourable
Mr.
Madam Commissioner, on September 21st, provisional agreement between Canada and European Union came into force. And we already can see how beneficial and right was this agreement. And we also could see that many of those who were opposing this agreement actually have been basing their opposition on false facts, or simply they were not informed enough. And I'm afraid, and I would like to warn also, that once we have to start to open these negotiations with such countries as New Zealand and Australia, we have to keep in mind that there are certain lessons we should learn from previous parts. And first of all, I would like to say that when America is now hesitant by doing trade deals, we, European Union, should go forward. Secondly, I would like to say that there is no place for exclusion of a number of sectors or certain sectors from these trade deals. And if those people who are so much trying to stand here by our farmers are so afraid from New Zealand, they rather would direct their energy to give right and just subsidies to such countries as Latvia and Lithuania, because also within the European Union inside we still have no justice in agriculture. I believe that we can make a nice and good deal where both sides can benefit.
Gracias. Señor Silva Pereira.
Mr. Silva Pereira.
Obrigado, Sr. Presidente. Não há nenhuma.
Thank you, Mr. President. There is no reason for Australia and New Zealand to remain without a free trade agreement with the EU and without negotiations with the EU. That's an absurd situation, and now we can change it by starting these negotiations. Australia and New Zealand are our partners. They share our values. They have a high level of social and environmental protection. So all the preconditions are in place for a new generation progressive agreement with both of those countries in the interest of sustainable development. We believe in transparency, the defense of Europe's interests, including sensitive matters like origin labeling, cereals and so on. We need to deliver on the expectations of our people.
Mr. Andrea.
Oui, merci, Monsieur le.
Thank you, Mr. President. We know that in these negotiations, Commissioner, agriculture is clearly the most sensitive aspect in the draft agreements. New Zealand, biggest producer of sheep meat, big producer, a big exporter of dairy products, with the lowest production costs anywhere in the world. And New Zealand, third biggest beef producer, and again there is the price differential. Sugar, especially specialised sugars, for our ultra-peripheral territories, these are sectors which have been fragilised and very sensitive within the European Union. And all of the concessions added up become untenable for individual sectors, quite apart from the impact of Brexit. And this needs to be factored in both by Commission and Council. Agriculture cannot be used as a bargaining chip, and it's essential that these sensitive areas, whether it's beef and dairy or sugar, should be excluded from the negotiations with Australia and New Zealand. Thank you very much.
Sí. Señor Andrieu.
Mr. Andrieu, there is a blue card request from Mr. Corbyn. Do you accept it?
Que usted pretende. Bien, bien, bien.
Very well.
Claro, es que levantó usted una tarjeta.
Did you raise a blue card? I believe there was some confusion. I think that's clear now. So we move to catch the eye. Mrs. Andrikiene has the floor.
Commissioner, colleagues, Australia and New Zealand are among the fastest growing developed economies, open and dynamic economies. Both countries have concluded numerous trade agreements with other partners. As the European Union does not have preferential bilateral trade arrangements with either of them, EU businesses have comparably less favourable conditions to access these markets. Our relationship with Australia and New Zealand has evolved over the past decades from a basic economic into a strategic political one that is based on common values, social and environmental standards, data protection and food safety requirements, and so on. Certainly, there are sensitive sectors in the EU's member states' economies, like meat and dairy sectors. So their interests and concerns have to be reflected in the trade agreement, and we have necessary instruments available to achieve that. Also, it is extremely important that negotiations are conducted in a transparent way, and a strong sustainability chapter is a must. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Señor Caputo.
Thank you, Mr. Caputo.
Thank you, President. I'd like to express my concern, as do millions of European citizens, because of the potential risks from the new trade agreements with Australia and New Zealand. Because agriculture must not be used as a bargaining chip to get leverage and bigger access for non-agricultural goods and services. The fact is that we have got higher standards, and they've got to be underpinned and protected in both agreements. We have sensitive sectors in agriculture, such as beef, sheep meat, goat meat, sugar, cereals, and cheese, many of which are just emerging from a serious crisis, which required exceptional and temporary support schemes and methods, and we do not want to see those sectors being placed under further stress. And I think that what we need, therefore, is bilateral safeguard measures which are appropriate and effective, and also we need adequate quotas. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Marias. Thank you very much, President. The agreement between the EU and Australia and New Zealand could reinforce the economic relations between Greece and New Zealand, and in particular Austria, where we've got a very substantial Greek diaspora. This affects many different parts of the economy, in particular the agriculture sectors as well, where of course Australia and New Zealand are very strong, and therefore protection measures must be put in place in Greece and in other countries in the European Union, so that we don't get, for example, things such as Greek feta. We don't want to see ourselves being suffering from competition in things such as that. And as with CETA, we need transparency in the course of those negotiations. And it must be clear that this is a hybrid agreement, a mixed one, so that the national parliaments are properly involved. And this must get the imprimatur of national parliaments. Let's not make the mistakes that we did with CETA, where it was put into effect on a temporary basis without national parliaments being properly involved. Let's get that clear right from the get-go. Thank you very much.
Señor Korwin-Mikke.
Mr. Korwin-Mikke.
Mr. President, it is a shame that European Union, huge European Union, is afraid of a small New Zealand laying 10,000 miles from Europe. It is a shame that European Union, who takes care of the poor people, now takes interest of the producers, not of the poor people, who want to have a cheap New Zealand butter. New Zealand's butter is very good, and I want to eat New Zealand's butter, cheap New Zealand's butter. Thank you very much.
Gracias, señor Polčák.
Thank you, Mr. Polčák.
Děkuji, pane předsedo.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. President. I think for the first time in my European parliamentary career, I agree with Mr. Korwin-Mikke. New Zealand is culturally and politically very close to us, and I think it's unthinkable for trade to be worth only €8 billion a year. It's time to stop protectionism. Of course, we need certain safeguards, but trade cannot be blocked by means of protectionism. Let's seize the opportunities offered by the Trump era. Let's embrace free trade with countries that we've been talking to for 20 years. There is the scope for a good agreement, and we shouldn't leave out any entire sector. Thank you.
Gracias. Señora Malmström.
Thank you, Commissioner Malmström.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, honourable members. As so many of you have said, we are talking about two friends and allies, New Zealand and Australia, who share not only values, our commitment to rule of law, human rights, progressive trade, but also a strong commitment to uphold international organisations and global rules when it comes to trade. And in this world today, that is not negligible. We need friends like that. Our current exports to these countries are more than our exports to Canada, and it can be much bigger. We have done a very thorough preparatory work with both Australia and New Zealand. They are aware of the debate here in Europe, they are aware of our sensitivities, they are aware of the political discussions in some of the countries relating to trade. Of course, we cannot exclude the whole agricultural sector. That makes absolutely no sense to do that. But we are aware of the sensitive parts of this. But it needs to be put in perspective. It is worth noting that New Zealand and Australia already today benefit from preferential access to EU for sensitive products because of WTO quotas. And while for beef, the small country-specific quotas are almost used, the use of quotas for sheep meat and dairy have declined the past years. And that means that Australia and New Zealand have found new, other, more attractive markets for their exports and diverted their exports increasingly to other countries in Asia, where they have trade agreements. In the case of New Zealand, about two-thirds of our imports are agricultural goods. Sheep meat makes one-third of EU agricultural imports from New Zealand, and it already today enters duty-free as a result of a historical and very large tariff rate quota. And in the case of Australia, agriculture is less than one-sixth of our total imports, and the biggest import is oilseed, canola, mostly used for biodiesel production in the EU. We actually have a growing surplus in agriculture trade, and especially in high value added processed agricultural products. So we do have sensitive products, absolutely, and there are ways to deal with that with tariff rate quotas, phasing in, etc. But we also have offensive interest, and not least if we can get New Zealand and Australia to accept the geographical indications, which means so much for our agriculture sector. On transparency, yes, you can rely on the Commission. We will do this in utmost transparency, continuing the tradition to publish documents and to liaise with you in different areas. We sent the draft mandates from the Commission directly to the national parliaments so that they can start yesterday looking into them, setting up the different committees or sectors or what they want to be able to follow closely these relations and these negotiations. Of course they should be involved, but they don't necessarily have to vote in the end, but they should be involved, and much more than in the past. That is a national responsibility as well. And as you know, we are setting up a permanent advisory group for all our trade agreements, where business, trade unions, environmental organisations, consumer organisations will be involved, because we do want to listen to their advice, and that is part of the new, more inclusive trade policy. Now, New Zealand and Australia are, of course, two different countries, different traditions, different politics. We have started the process at the same time. We have finished the scoping. We finished the Commission's work of proposing the mandate at the same time. And I guess, but I'm not sure, that the Council will give their allowance to start the negotiations at the same time, as you have chosen to deal with the reports at the same time. But each country will have their own path of negotiation. If we are ready with one country, then we will conclude with that country. It will not have to wait for the other one. And as I said, in this process, rest assured that the European Parliament will be fully aware. Thank you very much for this debate, and I hope that you vote wisely tomorrow morning.
Muchas gracias, señora comisaria.
Thank you very much, Madam Commissioner. Mr. Fjellner has the floor.
And on behalf of the rapporteur, Daniel Caspary, I'd like to thank Madam Malmström for her presentation. One thing that I'm a little bit sad of, and that I think is sad with this debate, is the fact that it doesn't in any way reflect the trade that we have today with Australia or New Zealand. 99% of this debate was on agriculture. 99%, maybe even more, was on agriculture. But take Australia, that everybody's concerned with. Around 10% of our trade with Australia is agriculture. And you know what? In agriculture trade with Australia, we are winning. We import around 1.9 billion worth of agricultural products from Australia, but we export 3.1 billion worth of agricultural products. So those of you that tomorrow is set on voting to exclude a sector, the agricultural sector, please think twice. Think of what we could be losing. We live in dramatic times. The United States of America, Donald Trump, has withdrawn from his commitment to do free trade in the region. And in dramatic times, when the winds of change are blowing, some build walls, others build windmills. Let's be optimistic, not protectionistic, when we view this. If not, Europe will be losers. And that is nothing I want us to do in trade policy. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Se cierra el debate.
Thank you very much. This concludes the joint debate. The vote will be held tomorrow. Let us move on to the next item on today's agenda, the oral question on the question of neutrality of airline reservation systems and restriction of access to flight information. The author, Mrs. Monteiro de Aguiar, has the floor.
Muito obrigada, Sr. Presidente. Agradecer em primeiro lugar aos colegas que apoiaram esta.
Thank you. I'd like to start by thanking colleagues who supported my proposal, thanks to which we're now